Alright, so welcome back to Chapter 9. We stopped after Activity 2, which put your favorite shape on screen and then used the boundary box technique we talked about last time to sort of fence it in so that the user could move, slide, drag the shape around, but could not move it outside of the fenced in area. So there's a related skill, which is trying to determine whether or not the user has moved or dragged a shape into another shape or into even a region on the screen. The way we figure that out is by checking to see if the two shapes overlap. These are two-dimensional shapes. We know the size and location of each. We have the x and y coordinate of each. We have the width and height of each shape. So it's actually pretty easy, should you want to, from scratch, to write a chunk of if-then logic to tell if two shapes are overlapping. However, if we know a little bit more about Solr 2D and also draw into code, it gets even easier. So let's back up and learn two key things. First up is this content bounds attribute. So all display objects get content bounds as an attribute when they're created. That's built into Solr 2D. Although it kind of sounds similar to the bounding box that we talked about last time, and it is similar. It's a box and it does bound something, but the content bounds give you the rectangular shape that just encloses the display object. So it's not a fencing in sort of box, rather it's a box that defines how wide and how tall the object is on screen so that then you can kind of easily tell if something is overlapping it. So content bounds is tremendously helpful if we're going to write this function or write this code that's going to figure out if two shapes overlap. Knowing their content bounds is obviously going to be super helpful. That is built in. It's not something that draw into code adds. That's built into Solr 2D. You get it, automatically when you create a display object. Second thing to know is I've already written this function for you, and it's built into draw into code. So I've supplied a function called overlaps, and you can add it to your stack, and then you pass it two objects, any two objects, and call the function. And then the function takes those two parameter objects and just compares them. I do a little bit of error checking first, which is I want to make sure that somehow this didn't get called incorrectly. You have to pass it two non-nil objects. So if by accident you call it and pass it a nil object or only one parameter, then I don't want to do this logic because it'll create nil errors at the console. And then there's just these four comparisons where I'm saying, is there any way that the first parameter object overlaps the second parameter object based on these xmin and ymin and xmax and ymax attributes that are part of the content bounds table. So all the information I need to detect overlap is built into the content bounds tables for these two display objects. So syntactically, the way we'll detect overlap is we'll check for overlap as the drag is ongoing. So we'll be doing it in our touch handler, and inside the part of the touch handler that determines the new XY value as the user moves their finger. In other words, we're doing this in the same location that we were doing the fencing activity last time. So it's the same chunk of code. We're looking in that portion of the code right after TX and TY have been set, and then we'll just check. Because it moved a pixel in some direction, we want to check and see, hey, does it overlap? So really basically what you can see is, here's a basic overlaps check. So if I have two objects in my stack, object 1 and object 4, and I'm dragging one or both of them around, then I can check to see if there's any overlaps by calling my overlaps function and passing it the two objects I want to check to see if there is overlap. And all this is doing here is saying, hey, if overlap occurs, then change the fill color, in this case to red, to show you that we have some overlap. So let's do it and see what something like this would look like. So we're gonna do this basic task, which is we're gonna put two shapes on screen. So I'm gonna put a circle, and just because I like polygons. I'm going to put a polygon, and I kind of like, for this activity, I kind of like the arrow. So I'm switching the polygon shape to an arrow. And now what I want to do is I want to allow one or both of these to be moved. So I want to add the touch listener to one or both of these, and kind of makes sense to me to add it to the arrow. So we'll be dragging the arrow around. So I'm going to select the arrow in the stack, and I'm going to hit the add listener button, and I'm going to select the touch listener. So that creates all of this code. Inside of your app, we have a touch handler function, and we have the default snippet that contains all of the code to allow the dragging. So if we save this, I'm going to save it in my Chapter 9 folder as, let's call it overlap test 1. This should actually drag, right? If you run it, if you save it and test it, what you should be able to do is drag the arrow around. Nothing, nothing outrageously surprising here, right? We've been able to do that before. All the code's written for us to do that, but what we want to do now is check for overlap. All right, so I want to get into that snippet, which is the touch support snippet, and I want to find my way to the moved portion of it that handles the moved phase. So that's here, this code. I want to leave the code in there that's there. If I were to take this out, that would take away dragging, and that would make it impossible for there to be any overlap unless the two objects started out overlapping. Anyway, so leave the code that's there, give yourself a little room if you're following along to work. And then I need to write the if statement, but for the if statement to work, I need to back up and I need to add the overlaps function. So I'm going to head back to the stack. I'm going to move to the functions menu and just have a look at it. We've got detect overlap, which is the first one, and that's the one we want. Get boundary box we used last time. Convert range is super handy, especially when you're using sliders, round number, format percent, and then the new function, which we've used quite a bit of. Detect overlap is what we want. So if you hit detect overlap, you'll see added to your stack is a new function called overlaps, and I'm going to move it up to the top where I would put app variables or utility methods that are going to be called by other methods. Now, here's where I'm going to back up on the slides, because you might notice, let me zoom into the overlaps function. All right, wow, that's wide. So you might notice it looks similar. We're still using content bounds. We've got this nil check. It's actually a little bit more involved. So on line 14, you'll see I check to see if both of the parameters are nil and whether or not their content bounds are nil. So it's possible you could send overlaps an object that's not a display object and doesn't have content bounds, in which case that this check is not going to work. So I do a little bit more careful error check, which is what's making this so wide. But then, the bigger thing that I wanted to mention is I'm using A and B. So the function is still called overlaps, but I call the two parameters it gets A and B. So in the keynote, I called them object 1 and object 2. So why did I switch? And does it matter? So the first point is it doesn't matter. The parameters inside of the function are names that you give that you'll use inside of the body of the function to refer to whatever two things were passed to this function. Whatever you pass it inside of this function will be referred to now as A and B. You can call them whatever you want, as long as whatever you want is a valid Lua identifier. So calling them object 1 and object 2 is fine, but it does seem a little bit like two drawn a code, script objects. I always have this issue with students who they use the overlaps function and then they think, well, wait a minute, I need to go in and edit the function and change it because I don't have A and B. I have object 4 and object 8 or whatever. So I'm going to go in here and edit all of these to say object 4 and object 8. So you don't want to do that. The function is perfect the way it is. It works awesome the way it is. You do not need to change a line of code in it. So if you start thinking that I need to go in and change some code in the overlaps function, step back and take a deep breath and remember the overlaps function is fine. It works fine. A and B are correct. I'm going to use A and B inside of the method to refer to whatever two objects you send it. You'll send those objects in the line of code we're about to write. Okay, in my stack, the way it's designed, I'm on line 49. Okay, so how do we check for overlap? I'm going to use an if statement. So I'm going to put in my keywords. I need if, I need a then, and I need an end. Let me put a comment too, just as a matter of practice. I'm going to say check for overlap. I misspelled overlap. Check for overlap between object 1 and object 2, right? Object 1 is the circle, and object 2 is the polygon. So the way I do that is I'm going to call my overlaps function, and then I'm going to pass it the two objects that I want to check for overlap. So I'm going to pass it object 1 and object 2. I'm not passing it A and B. A and B are used inside of the overlaps function so that I can compare whatever two objects are sent to it. I pass it here the two objects I want to check. And if there's overlap, let's do what we did, or what I did in the keynote, which is we'll set the target, the fill color of the target to red. So the target was the circle, so I'm going to say object 1 set fill color some reddish value. 1 tends to be kind of a brash red. I don't really like it. If you're following along, what you have here is just 3 lines of code really that you've added. The if statement, the call to the overlaps function. Overlap checks to see whether there is overlap using content bounds, and it returns a Boolean true or false. So if overlap ends up being true, the overlap function returns a true, which causes the code inside of the if statement to execute. If overlaps returns a false, then the code inside of the if statement is skipped. It's a basic if-then Boolean condition branching the flow of execution, unless I've done something wrong. So let's save it and test it. All right, I should be able to drag this, and when there's overlap, it did change it. Let me refresh it so you can see it again if you missed it, but there we go. Now maybe you'll notice that it's not exact because the circle's content bounds includes space around it, which is not part of the circle. So depending on how you do it, and the arrow of course does the same thing. So worst case scenario for these two shapes is coming in diagonally, where it's going to turn red maybe much sooner than you might think. But again, if in your mind you picture the content bounds around the shapes, the overlap is occurring when those two content bounds overlap, not necessarily the shapes themselves. We will get to more precise detection in a couple weeks as part of physics. The other thing obviously about this is it stays red, right? I'm not overlapping anymore, but it's still red. Why is it still red? Well, it's still red just because that's how we wrote the code. We said when overlap occurs, set the fill color to red. We don't ever set it back to white. So as a basic kind of attempt at making this a step better, we could also say else set it back to white, right? Object 1 set fill color 1 will get us white. See how well this works. Pretty well. So if you're following along, you should get something that's working a bit better. This code is somewhat inefficient in that it's checking pixel by pixel as you're moving the arrow. So it's checking for overlap up here, which is fine, but it's also setting the fill color of the circle to white constantly, right? I've just moved it, 400 pixels, which means it's updated the color of the circle to white 480 times when it didn't need to, right? Does that make sense? Likewise, also, if I'm overlapping and I'm moving around, it's constantly resetting the color of the circle to red, which it doesn't need to do because the circle's already red, right? So in terms of CPU overload or overhead, this is keeping the processor busier than it needs to be, which could have repercussions if it's a complex app, a game where lots of stuff is moving and going on at the same time. You want to be more efficient than this. Ideally, you only want to change the color of the circle. For instance, when it's white and needs to change to red, you want to change it just then and not change it again until it's red and needs to be changed to white. Then you want to change it to white and not again. So we'll rewrite our code to make it more efficient. Okay, so activity 3, we're going to do as well. Since I've already kind of started this, I'm just going to continue going along with the version that we had. But the goal of activity 3 is to add that bit of sophistication that we just talked about, which is I really only want the fill colors changing, or more broadly, I really only want to take action when I need to, when the overlap occurs, and then when it stops occurring. Not every pixel moved, no matter if there's a chance of overlap or not. Okay. So, like I said, I'm just going to keep going with this design. Just for fun, I'm going to add a little bit more to the circle. So I have a white circle in there. I want to add a smaller red circle. So I'm going to create another circle. I'm going to set the fill color to red. And I think I picked 0.800 there. And then I want to change the radius so that it's smaller. I'm going to make it like that. And then I'm going to add one more just for overkill, which is going to be the smallest one. And it's right in the center like that. So it kind of makes you feel like going to Target, doesn't it? Anyway, it is our target. It's got 3 circles. They're just stacked on top of each other. So there's a large white circle, a medium-sized red circle, and a small white circle. And they are object 1, object 6, and object 7. The other thing I need is a variable. So to do this kind of detection where I need to be able to keep track of whether the arrow is currently overlapping the target or not, I need to know that as the moving is occurring and to have it set and only change it when it needs to change. So I need to have something which remembers, hey, was I over? Am I already over the target, or am I not already over the target? So if we have that variable, we'll be able to make our set color stuff much more effective. So I'm going to add a snippet. I'm moving it up towards the top. I'll call it app variables. I need a variable that tells me whether I'm already over the target or not. And when the app starts, I'm not, so I'll start it out at false because that matches what the reality is. You can call it almost whatever you want. You don't want to call it overlaps because you already used overlaps as the name of a function. I'm going to call it already over, and I'm going to set it to false. That may be overly wordy and an awful lot of typing. You could call it something much shorter if you wanted, but as always, you're going for something which is descriptive and which will remind you of what the meaning of the variable is. And if you were sharing code with another team member, for instance, that they would look at it and go, oh, I know what that does. That would be ideal. So that's at the top of our stack, followed by the overlaps function, followed by some of our UI stuff. I'm actually going to move the circles up so that they're grouped together, but I'm going to be careful to keep them in order, because if I get the order wrong, then, for instance, if I move the small circle up, it's going to tuck in behind the medium red circle, which I don't want. I want the order like this so I can see all 3 circles. And I moved them up so that the polygon was added after, so that it will be on top of the target. I could have also just selected the polygon and pulled it to front using its object details panel. That would have worked as well. In any event, I've got the stack set up the way I want it. Now I've got to edit the snippet. So I'm going back into the default touch handler snippet where we've already done some work. So we were working right over here. The bulk of what we're doing is still good. We still check for overlaps. We're still going to use an if statement. Let me leave this one in place. And then start over. That way we can refer back to that if we need to. Okay, so I still need an if statement. But let's think about it. Well, let's write a comment. So I want to know, check for overlap when not already over. And I also want to check for non-overlap when already over. The two change conditions are when it overlaps but it was not already over, and then when it moves off of but it was over. So I want to say something like if not already over and overlaps object 1 comma object 2 then, and then I need an else if and I need an end. So my two checks are, number one is if it was not already over but now overlaps, that's a change. So I'm actually, just to test this as step 1, I'm going to do a print over. And then here I'm going to say, oh sorry, not here. Here I'm going to say if it is already over, so if already over and now it doesn't overlap, not overlaps, object 1, object 2, then print not over. The other key thing you have to do here is you have to update already over. So if you're not already over but now are, I actually want to also say already over is now true. And if you were already over but now aren't, I want to set it back to false. So I'll say already over equals false. So let's save it and see if that solves our problem. Dragging over, and now it just says over. And when I'm off, it says not over, but doesn't keep saying not over. Over, not over. So this has now made our code aware of the two states that it needs to be keeping track of, which is whether it's over or not over. And now we can do stuff to make it more visual, right? We have the code working. So if it's over, I want to change it. Let's say the inner one to red, the middle one to white, and the outer one to red. Object 1 set fill color, and I want it to be red, so I'll say 0.800. The middle one is object 6, so I'm going to say object 6 set fill color 1. Alright, and then object 7 is the inner circle, which I want to be red. Object 7 set fill color to red. I like that red better. Okay. I need to do these same things again. If it's not overlapped, just to save a little bit of typing, I'm copying those 3 lines of code, and I'm going to move over here and paste them. Should add some comments. Set over colors. Down here it'll be set not over colors. Okay, and so I'm just going to change it so that that is white. This one's red, white. Unless I actually do have them backwards, that should be what I want. So let's save it and test it. All right, there's our fancy target. Here's our arrow. So we should see, yeah. So if you're following along, you should get a kind of a cool effect here, which is the target kind of inverting colors when you're over it and switching back when you're not over it. The code, let me put the code back up. So part of the added complexity is just that I'm doing more set color stuff, but the real complexity is in the if statements. So where I'm saying if it's not already over but now is, so if not already over and overlaps object 1 and object 2, then I'm now over. So I update already over, and then I set the fill colors. And the other bit of logic here is to test to see if it's already over but now is not overlapping. So if already over and not overlaps object 1, object 2, now I'm not over. So I update already over and update my fill colors. You should see activity 3 now. So we just did it. So if you follow along, you just did activity 3. Congratulations. Okay, another type of music, also kind of cool in games, is background music. In addition to sound effects, which we've been working with, and you guys have done a lot of stuff with fun magical sound effects, we can also have just a background bit of music playing. Lots of games, for instance, have background music, that's distinct when the app starts up, or each level has a distinct, bit of background music, or each phase has a distinct background music. So these tend to be larger files. Sound effects tend to be kind of small, a couple dozen K maybe, but a background sound might actually be, real music, and it might actually be a few minutes of real music. So they tend to be kind of larger, maybe a couple megabytes instead of a few kilobytes. And the way most computers work with these larger sound files is that they don't read the entire sound file into memory. Rather, they read it off of the storage device as much as they need to play, and then they start playing it. And then they keep reading and playing at the same time, so that they never have more than a few K in memory. Rather, they just read and play and keep moving through the audio file. So this is called a stream. We have been using audio.load sound to load sound effects. The alternative is to load the audio as a stream to play background music. And to do that syntactically, we're going to use audio.load stream. The syntax is we load it as a stream. All we need to know is the name of the file we want to play, the music we want to play. So I have an example music file in the download for this chapter. And then to play it, there's a couple of extra things I can specify for background music. One is, do I want it to play repeatedly? In other words, does it go for its 2 minutes and then start over? Or does it play once and it's done, and then maybe you play a second sound effect? And then also for background music, you can have it sort of fade in dramatically so that it doesn't just start bam, but you hear it kind of gradually getting louder and louder. So that's the fade in milliseconds, totally optional. You might be wondering about the -1. You can tell it how many times you want it to repeat. Then the question is, well, how would I tell it to keep repeating forever? Do I put infinity here? Or do I type some absurdly large number? Well, no, what Solar2D did, what Corona did was, in cases like this, they said, we'll just pass it a -1. -1's not a valid loop, so we'll interpret the -1 as just keep playing forever. All right, and then sound file formats, you guys are probably aware of sound files coming in several different formats. WAV, I've listed a few of the common ones here, WAV, MP3, AAC or M4A, OGG, and CAF files, and there are more certainly. These are all ones that Solar2D can play. The issue is, one of these cross-platform issues, is that, well, Android plays OGG, but iOS by default doesn't. iOS plays CAF, and AAC M4A files by default, but Android doesn't. So then you're stuck with probably wanting to avoid these sound formats that are more proprietary, because if you use a bunch of, let's say, music you've bought from iTunes or downloaded that's compatible with iTunes, well, then you're out of luck on Android. You want to pick a sound that is in a format that will play on both of the platforms, assuming that you want to take advantage of being able to place your new app in both of the app stores, then WAV and MP3 are the two formats that you want to stick with. So we'll just add the background music to this to make it, completely awesome. Sounds are in actions, so head over to the actions palette. I want to load the sound. Well, there's a variation of it, Jewel Beat Light Swing, which is awesome. So I loaded it, but it's not playing. So if you're confused, just think, did I expect it to be playing? Is that confusing now? It's okay if it is, but then just look at the stack and see I've loaded the sound, but I haven't played it. Remember, playing it is a separate step. I'm also going to move the load sound up to the top with other app level variables, just because that's where I put that stuff, so I know in the stack where to look. Importantly here, we need to adjust this load sound. So the default in Draw No Code that I set, my default expectation is that most sounds you load are going to be sound effects. If you want to change that, you use this button here, Load Sound As Sound Effect. If you click it, it'll change it to background music. Under the hood, if you peek at the code, what you'll see is it's changing it from audio load sound to audio load stream. So if I can keep both on screen, you'll see here's the sound effect version. If I update it, there's the background sound version. Still haven't played it, so I want to play it. So I need a play sound object, and I only have one sound, so I'll select it. Doesn't really matter where it is in the stack. If you want it to play when the app loads, then keep it in that main, the main execution thread of the stack. If you wanted the sound to start maybe only when the overlap occurs, then you could work it into the touch handler in some way. But since this is just kind of ambient mood music, that's a little loud. It is cool. It makes the game twice as fun. It only played through once because I said loops 0. If you hover over it, you'll get the tooltip that gives you the key information about -1. So hover over it. It'll say number of times to play the sound. -1 means infinite. So if you change that to -1, it'll play over and over and over and over and over again. I don't actually really want that at this point, but 0 is good. Repetition with timers. So timers are another key game skill for you. They're super easy to use. So you can set up a timer and tell it how many times to run and how frequently to run it. So the table in Solr 2D is called timer. It has a function built in called perform with delay, and you pass it the initial delay and the period of the timer. This is 1,000 milliseconds or 1 second. You pass it a function to run. Object 10 on timer handler is a variation that was written by Draw No Code, and then you give it the number of times you want it to repeat. So this is a complete example here that would count to 10, but instead of spitting out 1 to 10 as fast as it could possibly do it, it'll count it out 1 per second. So I have an activity in the keynote, but I'll leave that one for you to do. It's kind of fun to do, but I'm going to do really quickly the count to 10 one that's with a second pause. So I want a timer. Timers are in the actions palette, so we're already in the actions palette. So look for timer, and there's timer right there. So hit timer. That'll add a timer to your stack. And you can see it's added a timer script object, a function to run, and a default snippet. So if I want to count, I need a variable. Anytime you count, you need a variable. So I'm going to go to snippets, add new snippet. I'm going to name it the counter, and I'm going to create a variable called count, and I'll start it at, it doesn't matter, 0 or 1. And then I'm going to jump into the event handler and then add some code. So the code in this snippet will be run by default every second. And I'm going to say count equals count plus 1, and then I'm going to print count. Sorry, I'm going to move that snippet up since it's an app variable up to the top. I'm going to go to the timer and look at this, and it's set to repeat 1 time. So I'm going to change that to try to change it to 10 times, see what we get. I'm going to save it as Mobile Designs Chapter 9, count to 10. How's that? And so when it runs, you'll see nothing on the screen, but you'll see, hey, there's stuff popping out to the console. And you can't see it all, but let me resize it. And let me restart this. So what you should see is this kind of timer heartbeat running, and every second we do something. What we do every second is increment the counter and display the results. I do also, in the default snippet for the counter, I keep track of how many milliseconds it was since the last time it was executed. I do this because it's useful to know, and also if you're looking at this, you might notice I asked the timer to run every 1,000 milliseconds, but the first timer doesn't run until about 1100. In fact, all of them are off about 100 milliseconds. So that's the amount of time, that's the amount of time it took to start the timer. And then the rest of it is just a bit of imprecision. So it's not guaranteed to be to the millisecond. It's a bit off, but certainly for what we're doing, it's more than good enough. This is what I wanted to get to today. Obviously, you might have picked that up from the big stop here sticky note I had on the keynote. This leaves us with some fun stuff next time. Gamey kind of apps that involve the timer, getting stuff on screen via the timer, also being able to drag stuff and tap stuff on screen with apps that build interface elements using a timer. So I guess much more gamey stuff, much more fun stuff as well.